Good morning. It is Friday, February the 4th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare, the novena, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch and Apocalypse Now. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 4th. I will destroy the works of lust and perversion. My child, don't be fooled. Anyone who keeps on sinning belongs to the devil. He has sinned from the beginning, but my Son came to destroy all that he has done. If anyone loves the world, my love is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of me, but is of the world. The world is passing away and the lust of it. When you ask why the land perishes and burns up like a wilderness so that no one can pass through, I will respond, because you have forsaken my law which I set before you, and I have not obeyed my voice, nor walked according to it. Therefore I will scatter those who do the works of lust and perversion, and will send a sword after them until I have consumed them. Genesis chapter 19, verses 12 through 13, 1 John chapter 2, verse 16, Jeremiah chapter 9, verses 12 through 16. Prayer declaration. Let the spirits of lust and perversion be destroyed with your fire. Pass through the land and burn up all wickedness and perversion from out of it. The world is passing away and the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 4th. Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that understands that conservatism is not just about politics, but culture as well. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He is open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he is better than the socialist. He is a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. Thank you, thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. All rational action is, in the first place, individual action. Only the individual thinks, only the individual reasons, only the individual acts. Ludwig von Mises. You are seeing here a key philosophical tenet in a market economics versus Marxian collectivism. A high view of human dignity leads to a high view of the individual, of man as unique and special in his or her context as an image bearer of God. The Marxian view is that history is inevitable and unconcerned with the individual. Material forces will bring the individual along, but the individual play no noteworthy role in the direction of mankind. Subordination of the individual to a collective is a foundational view of those who oppose free enterprise. The collectives reflect the irrational acts of individuals. That collectives reflect the irrational acts of individuals is the foundational view of those who cherish free enterprise. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you, thank you. And now, Apocalypse Now. The Ice Age was returning. The skyscrapers of New York would vanish under a mile-high ice sheet. Pitiful Canadian refugees would stream southward toward Panama, and millions would starve as the world's crops failed in the new cold weather. And all of this was going to happen within a very few more years, the newspapers warned. As the Dead Sea Scrolls remind us, the impulse to declare that the end is nigh has been driving men to grow beards and retreat into the deserts for millennia. One of the strange tendencies of modern life, however, has been the institutionalization of scaremongering, the willingness of mass media and government to lead plausibility to wild surmises about the future. The crucial decade for this odd development was the 1970s. One of the most terrifying of those scares was instigated by a professor named Paul Ehrlich in a 1968 book, The Population Bomb. The battle to feed all of humanity is over. In the 1970s, the world will undergo famine. Hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. In a style exactly like that of the Rand Corporation and the United Nations, Ehrlich produced a range of scenarios, from best case to worst case. The worst case led to the total extinction of mankind in a nuclear holocaust. Here's the best case. Quote, in 1974, the United States government finally realizes that the food production balance in most of Asia, Africa, and South America is such that most areas cannot attain self-sufficiency. American expeditionary forces are withdrawn from Vietnam and Thailand, and the United States announces it will no longer send food to India, Egypt, and some other countries which it considers beyond hope. A moderate food rationing program is instituted in the United States, unquote. The Pope, yielding to pressure from enlightened Catholics, then endorses birth control and abortion and urges reduction of birth rates. Alas, even in the best case, quote, famine and food riots sweep Asia. In China, India, and other countries of Asia, central governments weaken and then disappear, unquote. Russia falters. Quote, famine and plague sweep the Arab world, unquote. Quote, most of the countries of Africa and South America slide backward into famine and local warfare, unquote. There's what Ehrlich calls a, quote, major dieback, unquote. Afterward, the rich countries imposed central economic planning and forced population control programs upon the poor. Ehrlich came to the reluctant conclusion that this optimistic scenario was unrealistic because it presupposed a maturity of outlook and behavior in the United States that seems unlikely to develop in the near future. The media displayed a limitless appetite for this malarkey. Ehrlich was invited onto The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson some 25 times in the 1970s. Ehrlich's fabulous success inspired imitators. Through the 1970s, grim-faced pundits stepped forward to urge Americans to accept in the name of realism and ecology the imminent deaths of tens of millions of third-worlders. In the 1974 article, the environmentalist Garrett Hardin coined the phrase lifeboat ethics to describe the policies he recommended. If you're in a lifeboat after a shipwreck, it's tempting to save everyone bobbing in the water around you, but take aboard too many and the boat is swamped and everyone drowns. For this reason, Hardin opposed any emergency food aid to the starving. Aid, he warned, only encourages breeding. Also popular was the idea of triage, a phrase borrowed from military medicine. After a battle, doctors divide the wounded into three categories: the least wounded, which will recover without help, the badly wounded, who will probably die even with help, and the moderately wounded, who will survive only if they get treatment. Then they concentrate their efforts on the last group. In just such a way, argued the 1967 book Famine 1975, the United States ought to rationalize its food aid. Libya might be able to survive without aid. It falls into Category 1. Overpopulated India is doomed no matter what. It falls into Category 2. But Pakistan shows potential for self-sufficiency and should therefore be assisted. It must be stressed that despite the sensational title, the proponents of triage were highly regarded scholars, and their contentions were repeated in magazines like the Atlantic Monthly. The overpopulation fright found a popular audience, too, with movies like Soylent Green, a 1973 film set in 2022, when 40 million people live in New York City and only the very rich can afford fruit or meat. And Logan's Run, a 1976 movie about a future society that kills its members at age 30, depicting a world so short of food that only planned murder and high-tech cannibalism sustain civilization. If anything, serious thinkers are even more alarmed than Hollywood. Almost immediately upon taking office in 1977, President Carter appointed a commission of doomsayers led by Gerald O. Barney of the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation to analyze environmental trends and offer recommendations. The commission's report, dubbed Global 2000, was delivered immediately before the 1980 election. It predicted continuing high population growth, stagnating food production, a rapid decline in oil production after the mid-1990s, skyrocketing mineral and commodity prices, and severe water shortages in the Third World. These bad tidings seem to have heavily influenced President Carter's thinking. They undergirded his energy plans and may have accounted for the despair and pessimism that he radiated throughout the 1980 campaign and that did so much to cost him the election. Back in a minute. Thank you. Carter's pessimism flew in the face of the available facts. Julian Simon, an economist who made a career out of debunking scare stories, noted that between 1948 and 1979, world food production per person rose about 37%. The rise would have been more impressive still, but for the collapse of agriculture in Mao's China. It was true that Africa immediately south of the Sahara had suffered a terrible famine in 1974-75. But as with most famines, people starved because of malign politics rather than an absolute shortage of food. In the west of Africa, the government of Mali refused to distribute emergency food supplies in the countryside in hope of crushing rebellion among the Tuareg nomads. In the east, the new revolutionary government of Ethiopia was using a Stalin-style famine to force through a Stalin-style collectivization of agriculture and bolster its power. There was no necessity for triage. More than sufficient stocks of food existed to save all the victims of crop failure if, and this was crucial if the governments of the starving did not impede the delivery of the food for reasons of their own. If fears of disaster were so unconvincing, why did they find such a large audience? The unconscious mind wants to be taken seriously and not to be laughed at, the historian Edward Shorter has observed. People therefore express their anxieties in terms compatible with the spirit of the age. They reported visits from demons in the 60s. Their descendants reported visits from extraterrestrials in the 90s. Someone whose ancestor believed her skin tingled because she had been cursed now believes her skin tingles because of multiple chemical sensitivity. And what a modern society feels troubled, as it did in the 70s, it looks for a scientific-sounding grounds for its premonitions of doom. The world is unhappy. It is unhappy because it does not know where it is going and because it senses that if it knew, it would discover that it is heading for disaster. So French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing observed in 1974, and with apparent reason. The Arab oil boycott had turned the lights off all over Europe. A global inflation was squeezing living standards. The long post-war boom seemed to have ended. Further in the background, there lurked deeper anxieties. Some feared that the relative position in the world of Europe and America was declining relative to Africa and Asia. Between 1900 and 1975, Europe's share of world population dropped from 24% to 16%. That of the United States barely held steady at 5%. Others suffered anxiety because the great meaning-providing intellectual systems of the past, Marxism, Freudianism, and so on, were collapsing under the weight of contradictory evidence. What more satisfying revenge could there be on Arabs and Africans who had turned off the oil spigot than to imagine them dying for lack of American grain? And for intellectuals who yearned for a substitute for their ebbing socialist faith, ecology seemed to offer an exciting new justification for an authoritarian elite of central planners. After all, food was more expensive in 74 than it had been in 67. Was it not logical to infer that it would be more expensive still in 81? Apocalyptic fantasies were stoked above all by the discomfort with children that suffused the new self-oriented culture of middle-class Americans and Europeans. Listen again to Ehrlich as he offers suggestions on what steps should be taken to save the planet. First, he recommends killing all pets. The world could not afford useless mouths. Then, onto human babies. Many of my colleagues feel that some sort of compulsory birth regulation would be necessary. Ehrlich himself was not quite ready to go so far as that. Instead, he would raise income taxes steeply on families with children. Further, luxury taxes should be placed on layettes, cribs, diapers, diaper services, expensive toys, and a governmental first marriage grant could be awarded each couple in which the age of both partners was 25 or more. There could be state prizes for each period of 5 years in which a couple delayed childbirth, and bonus grants for vasectomies. Abortion must be legalized and sex education in schools geared to de-emphasizing the reproductive purposes of sex. Poor countries must accept compulsory sterilization of their people. A cancer is an uncontrolled multiplication of cells. The population explosion is an uncontrolled multiplication of people. We must shift our efforts from treatment of the symptoms to the cutting out of the cancer. The operation will demand many apparently brutal and heartless decisions. The pain may be intense, but the disease is so far advanced that only with radical surgery does the patient have a chance of survival. Ehrlich urged his readers to join his mission to eradicate the disease of humanity by, for instance, commending friends who had no children, or at most one, and waggling their eyebrows at those that created 3 or more. Despite the complete discrediting of all the rest of Ehrlich's scheme, the anti-child evangelism he favors continues. Ask any mother of 3 about the casually insulting comments she receives from total strangers. One of America's richest men, David Packard, left his fortune to a foundation dedicated to population restriction. Another, Warren Buffett, has pledged to do the same. Credit Ehrlich, at least, with recognizing that the creed he was expounding was religion, not science. He understood that the severing of the connection between sex and reproduction and the deliberate withholding of life-saving assistance from famine-wrecked countries was incompatible with Christianity, or indeed any known monotheistic religion. He therefore recommended that the ancient faiths of mankind be jettisoned and replaced with a new pantheism and a new ethics that attached less value to human life. His followers would, however, borrow arresting images from the old religions, Noah's Ark, for instance. Like Noah, the United States could save only by first recognizing that it could not save everyone. There is more than a hint that just like the vicious generations in Genesis whose sins provoked God to drown them, the third world millions must go under for their sin of uncontrolled reproduction. Indeed, it could be argued that a softened version of Ehrlich's creed has already become the faith of hundreds of thousands of college-educated professional people. In 1937, Walt Disney had his Snow White pray to an unmistakably Christian God. The religion in Pocahontas and The Lion King is, however, strictly pagan. Back in a minute. Thank you. The dietary and clothing restrictions that environmentalists impose on themselves, the secular mass performed every day over the recycling bins with cans, bottles, newsprint, and compost, each carefully placed within its own holy container and left by the curb to await resurrection. What else is this but religion? Since the 1970s, hundreds of prophets have competed to win souls for their distinctive version of the new faith. Some prophets warned that climate change, not overpopulation, would usher in the apocalypse. A report written for the Central Intelligence Agency in 1974 by Reed Bryson of the University of Wisconsin warned that the benign interglacial period under which human civilization had blossomed over the past 10,000 years was coming to an end. Now the world hovered on the brink of upheaval almost beyond comprehension, a frigid period that would dramatically shrink crop production and trigger global famines lasting for at least 40 years, and maybe for centuries. It was Professor Bryson's good luck that the CIA decided to declassify his study in the spring of 1976 after an especially nasty winter. The story was splashed onto page 1 of the New York Times. Later that year, Stephen Schneider, a scientist with the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, put Bryson's warnings of global cooling into a talked-about book, The Genesis Strategy. The world, said Schneider, owed the prosperity of the 1950s and 60s to a favorable climate. Alas, since 1940, and particularly during the 1960s, there's been a sharp reversal of this warming trend in the Northern Hemisphere. In fact, average temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere has recently appeared to be moving toward lower levels reminiscent of times immediately prior to the 20th century. Schneider favorably quoted a 1974 warning from the International Federation of Institutes of Advanced Study that the direction of the climatic change indicates major crop failures almost certainly within the end of the decade. This, coinciding with a period of almost non-existent grain reserves, can be ignored only at the risk of great suffering and mass starvation. Schneider's book excited a frenzy of glacier hysteria. Television reports, magazine features, the front pages of local newspapers all explained how the glaciers came and went in cycles and that a renewed glaciation was due at any moment. We feel, said Walter Orr Roberts, a former observatory director at the National Atmospheric Research Center, in a 1976 colloquy with reporters at the Aspen Institute, that the downturn of temperature since 1950 and rapidly in the 60s probably represents a trend and isn't just a short-term chance fluctuation. We feel it's more likely that these colder average temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere will continue for 20 or 30 years, and therefore we consider it a significant climate effect that the world will probably have to contend with for a long time. Unless, of course, the problem was not that the world was cooling off, but that it was drying up. A meeting of the world climate experts sponsored by Rockefeller Brothers Foundation in 1974 observed with alarm that the Sahara Desert was advancing southward at a rate of about 30 miles a year, threatening the people of the grasslands of the Sahel. This conference was also was reported on the front page of the Times. Desertification, it was called, and soon the television sets of the Western world were beaming heart-rending pictures of nomads leading their cattle southward as the dust blew and the grass dried up. Then again, it could be equally that the world was neither cooling nor drying, but warming up. At the meeting of the American Geophysical Union in June 1977, a series of papers argued that the world's temperature was rising, and this was the real danger. The Carter administration was sufficiently impressed to create an Office of Carbon Dioxide Environmental Effects. Stephen Schneider jumped on this new bandwagon. The most quoted Ice Age alarmist of the 1970s became, in a neat public relations pivot, one of the most quoted global warming alarmists of the 1990s. The Lord High Executioner and the Mikado announced that it really didn't matter which names were put on his little list, and in that same cheerful spirit, it was less important to the new apocalyptics to know which catastrophe was going to ravage the world than to agree that some catastrophe was sure to do so. And that's the end of part 3 and the end of the chapter called Apocalypse Now, from How We Got Here, the 70s, a decade that, for better or worse, gave us modern culture. Thank you. So on this particular chapter, Apocalypse Now, it's all about so-called environmental issues, catastrophes, worldwide catastrophes. And environmentalism is Marxist in nature in that it disregards and ignores property and property rights. And so that's why it doesn't go anywhere. That's why it's not going to go anywhere. Environmentalism in general is because it's just not true. At human beings, one of the things that makes human beings unique and different from other animals is self-consciousness. And that self-consciousness breeds or produces an expectation of privacy. And that expectation of privacy then leads to property and property rights. And so, the essence is, I can do with my property as I see fit. If I pollute the air, for instance, of my neighbor next door, then the neighbor has remedies for that. They can file a lawsuit, etc. Okay. Now, some people at this point might say, well, taking your argument to its logical extreme, that means that the Constitution is a suicide pact. And because the ultimate question comes down to, what is more important, the Constitution of the United States or life itself? And the answer to that is the Constitution. The Constitution is saying that life is not worth living without the freedoms, without the liberties, without the rights that God has given us. That without those rights, we're less than human. We're just simply existing. We're just waiting to die. So, if anybody comes to you and says that, hey, the Constitution isn't a suicide pact, yes, it is. Okay? And we know that because Patrick Henry himself said, give me liberty or give me death. And there was another patriot, Patrick Henry? Or am I thinking? No, Nathan Hale. Patrick Henry used give me liberty or give me death. Nathan Hale said, I regret that I have but one life to live or to give for my country. So those are people that recognized that you cannot live unless you have your God-given rights respected and defended. You're not living. You're just existing, and again, waiting to die. So that's why environmentalism is doomed to fail, and the sooner the better. Thank you. And this is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, reminding you that good people to listen to in terms of getting the gist of what is true conservative in terms of communication is John and Ken. They're on 2 to 6 p.m. Monday through Friday on KFI AM 640. And that specific time, of course. You can also listen to their podcast, of course. So also, until we meet again, it will be, I'm reminding you to be polite, be smart, be beautiful, and remember that the left cannot win. It has no authority and no power, and it just can't win.